My boyfriend, Blake, let out a low sigh, is getting married. And I was the last one to know. Of course. The bride isn't me either. He had his arm around the newly seduced college girl and was showing off to his good buddies. Scarlett? She's an old woman. After 7 years. Who wouldn't get tired of her? Besides, she had an abortion. There was a dead life in her belly. She's dirty. In the private room, everyone burst into laughter. Violet was like a delicate daughter flower, snuggling in his arms. Outside the private room, I leaned against the wall and smiled mockingly in my heart. That's right. 7 years have passed. Who wouldn't get tired of it? I should also treat myself to something good. There was a sudden matter in the company today. I had already packed my things and was about to get off work. Recently, I've always felt dizzy in the head. I might be catching a cold. And my eyes are also a bit blurry. Looking at myself in the mirror, the once beautiful Scarlett was now haggard in the reflection. She could only barely maintain her outward glamour with makeup. The cooperative party suddenly put forward new requirements. Several young girls in the company had already picked up their bags and left happily, laughing. As a last resort, I had to make the planning document myself. When I finished my work, I found that it was already 9:30. I sent the planning document to the person in charge of the other company. About 5 minutes later, my WeChat dinged. Scarlett, are you free to have dinner together? I think you probably haven't eaten yet either. Right? It was Aiden, the young master of the zoo consortium. I heard that he just returned from studying abroad last year, and his family gave him a small company to practice with. But he seemed to have some issues with my boyfriend, Blake. They didn't like each other when they were kids. And even when they grew up, they still tried to trip each other up at work. To avoid unnecessary trouble, I directly refused him. I turned off the lights and went out. But in a moment, I received another message. When I opened it, it was still from Aiden. It was a photo. My boyfriend, Blake, had his arm around the new college girl in the company, Violet. The two of them looked intimate, and their eyes were full of affection. Immediately following was an address. I knew what Aiden was trying to do. I leaned in the car and rubbed my dizzy temples. I've really been too tired recently. I'm so tired that my heart has become a bit numb. When I saw Blake playing intimately with another woman, I could actually be so calm and composed. Even deep in my heart, I vaguely felt that it was all right. Just as it was. After all, loving too deeply is like a quagmire. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink. I closed my eyes, leaned in the car, and took a deep breath. After 2 or 3 minutes, I slowly started the car, drove out of the underground garage, and headed straight for that address. When I arrived, the banquet was coming to an end. Blake had his arm around his intern female assistant, Violet, with his eyes glazed from drinking. In my ears, there were the jeers of the crowd, shouting for them to drink a lover's cup of wine. I stood in the corner at the door, shielded by the screen. Like a stranger, I watched as they crossed their arms and drank the red wine in their glasses with lingering eyes. President Blake, are you really going to marry Violet? Someone asked Blake. Blake smiled triumphantly and proudly. Yes, then out a lull sigh. Violet is pregnant with my child. I can't let her be wronged. A trace of a proud smile flashed across Violet's face, and she leaned towards Blake. People who knew us well all knew that Blake and I were a couple. We had been dating since college. Before we even graduated from college, we started investing in our own company. We didn't have much money, so we couldn't afford to hire people. As the so-called vice president of the company, I was both the leader and the employee. To be specific, the whole company consisted of just Blake and me. He was busy with external affairs, having dinners and drinking every day. And I handled almost all the affairs of the company by myself. Later, the company gradually improved, and we had a little money in our hands. 3 years ago, in the warm spring when the flowers were in bloom, I told Blake with great joy that I was pregnant. There was a little life connected to me by blood. I discussed with him that we should get the marriage certificate first, and I wanted to give birth to this child. But when he heard this, his face changed. That was the first time I quarreled with him. He viciously accused me of being a scheming bitch. Scarlett. Did you get pregnant on purpose? Do you intend to employ such a clumsy and shoddy tactic to hold me captive, and keep the company in check? The company gave you shares. When have I ever shortchanged you a single cent of money? Do you really have to torture me with a child that I'm not prepared for? At that time, I stared at him blankly, as if looking at a stranger. In college, he chased me like crazy. He created all kinds of romantic atmospheres, sending good morning and good night greetings. There were flowers, candles, milk tea, perfume, lipstick, and handbags. He said that from the moment he saw me. He knew that I was the one destined for him. Scarlett. Do you know what it means to feel like you've waited for 10,000 years at the first sight? From the moment I saw you, it was as if I had waited for 10,000 years. And we finally met again in the vast sea of people. Thank Buddha. When he said these words, he put his hands together, looking just like a devout Buddhist. I threw myself into the sweetness and beauty of love. We founded the company together, ran business, and made plans. We laughed together, cried together, and had fun together. Now, with a child, the crystallization of our love, he wants me to have an abortion. I quarreled with him fiercely. I even thought about giving birth to the child by myself. But the next day, he cooked porridge and coaxed me. Scarlett. Let's have an abortion. The company has just started to show some promise. At this point, we really don't have the time to take care of a baby crying for milk. Scarlett. Can you really bear to let a child come into this world and suffer without any preparation? I gritted my teeth. I didn't want to have an abortion. I argued with him, appealing to his emotions and reasoning, and sticking firmly to my position. But a week later, I suddenly felt an unbearable pain in my abdomen. On the way to the hospital, Blake told me, Scarlett. I'm sorry. I'm still not ready to take on the responsibility of being a father. I can't just let a little life break into my world without being prepared. I gave you the abortion pill. I felt as if I had been struck by lightning. My eyes went dark, and I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to scold him and hit him. But my stomach hurt so much that I couldn't. Just like that, my child was gone. I lay listlessly in the hospital for a week, no matter how tenderly and affectionately Blake coaxed me. But there were a lot of things piled up in the company, and I couldn't just ignore them. So, I threw myself into work again. The cumbersome and busy work gradually made me forget the pain of the abortion. Now, Violet is pregnant, and he's going to marry her? Life is extremely ironic. The vows of eternal love still ring in my ears. He's inside, and I'm outside. A screen doesn't just block me, does it? 3. I heard my name. Someone asked Blake. President Blake, what about Scarlett when you marry Violet? Blake's laughter came over. Scarlett? Just deal with it as it should be dealt with. To be honest with you, ever since Scarlett had an abortion, I felt that she's dirty. Just the thought of there being a dead life in her belly gives me some psychological shadow. I can't let my future child lie in such a dirty womb. It seemed that everyone was laughing, and the laughter was especially harsh. Do you think she's stupid? She was still preparing for the wedding. I haven't even given the go-ahead. And she was making arrangements for the wedding. I can't let her efforts go to waste. Then, hello shawty's hanin, I'll just fulfill her wish, marry my little princess Violet. I slowly stepped back, on tiptoe, like a Persian cat stealing food. I turned to a corner on the side, far away from the private room. I wiped away the extra tears on my face, opened my phone, and sent a message to Aiden. Aiden, would you like to have dinner together? Have you eaten yet? First, I received the location sent by Aiden. And then he said to me, the food and wine are already ready, waiting for you. I walked into the restroom and touched up my makeup. During this time, I received a message from Blake. Scarlett, I have something to do tonight. My brothers are insisting on going to karaoke, so I won't be coming back. You go to bed early. I was applying eyeshadow. I freed up a hand and replied with one word, okay. If it were before, I would definitely have asked him in detail who he was drinking with. Who was he going to karaoke with? come back early after having fun. I would also have been worried if he would drink too much outside. Drinking is harmful to the body. And this was almost a constant reminder on my lips. Now, I feel so strange. I don't even want to chat with him with an extra word. Love is really a strange thing. When you love someone, you worry about them all the time and dare not forget them for a moment. Even when he was out drinking and having fun, I couldn't sleep peacefully. I had also advised him before. But he always said that contracts were all negotiated at the dinner table. So how could he not drink? I was really stupid. I originally thought that even if there were women at the dinner table, it was just for the occasion. Just like he once said to me. Scarlett, don't you know my feelings for you? I actually never knew his true thoughts before. Now, I know. For Aiden was in a high-end club next door. When I walked over, a waiter opened the door for me. Aiden personally pulled out the chair for me. He gave me a large bouquet of purple roses. I just smiled and casually put the flowers aside. On the table, the food and wine were already set out. In the clean and transparent glass, the red wine shimmered under the warm light. Aiden, I thought it through. I leaned back in the chair and smiled gently. I'm willing to sell you the shares of Jianju Company. Aiden smiled brightly and said, Scarlett, I knew you would sell the shares to me. After all, for a small company, with the shares in your hand, you only get a little dividend every month. It's better to sell them to me all at once. Take the money and become the chief financial officer of my Kiyuan consortium. How great would that be? Of course. If you want the shares of Kiyuan, we can also talk about it. I smiled, raised my glass to him, and said, Aiden, I don't want the shares of Kiyuan. But I want something else. As I spoke, I pulled out a flower from the large bouquet of roses and handed it to him. He looked at the rose I handed him and was stunned for a moment. I saw a trace of throbbing and a hint of panic flash through his deep eyes. I'm planning a wedding. It won't be very grand. But I've already ordered my wedding dress. I'm just short of a groom. Aiden took a deep breath, took the rose from my hand, and smiled. Happiness came so suddenly. I thought it was already my great luck to be able to recruit you to Kiyuan Company. I didn't expect that I would have even greater happiness. I smiled and said inferently. After all, I've been preparing for it for a while. I didn't play house when I was a child. So let's just consider it as playing a game now. I pondered that Aiden was different from me. I could have a casual wedding. But he was the young master of the Zoo Consortium. When he gets married in the future, his bride will surely be a young lady from a prestigious family. I couldn't ruin his reputation. We don't have to invite guests, I said. Aiden waved his hand and smiled. How can that be? We won't make a big fuss. After all, you're in a bit of a hurry. We can invite our mutual friends in the circle. I raised my glass and clinked it with his. I just prepared a wedding and was short of a groom. I didn't care about the rest. When Aiden didn't know that I was in a relationship with Blake, when we first met, he expressed his admiration and affection for me. Later, he formally confessed his love to me. At that time, I once smiled and told him that I was 27 years old and had a boyfriend whom I had been in love with since college and was already preparing for the wedding. When I said those words, there was joy in my eyes and brows. The feeling of happiness couldn't be hidden. There was a deep sense of loss in his eyes. As if he had lost something very important in an instant. He sighed and said that after all, he wasn't destined for me. He didn't approach me for more than a month. When there was an occasional work connection between the companies, he just handled it according to the normal procedures. Until today, he invited me to dinner and gave me the information about Blake and Violet. My heart was filled with mixed feelings. And I didn't know what it was like at all. The red wine slid down my throat. In the sweet aroma, there was a hint of rose fragrance. And also a faint astringency. It was very much like first love. In the following period of time, with the help of Aiden, I rented a house. Just like an ant-moving house. I moved my personal belongings out of Blake's place bit by bit. In the blink of an eye, the wedding was approaching. One day, when I got off work, Violet stopped me in the parking lot. Scarlett. She called me timidly. What's the matter? I asked inferently. It's like this. Violet stroked her belly, bit her lip, and looked like she was acting in a TV drama. I'm pregnant, she said to me. I smiled unfairly and said, congratulations. You're pregnant right after graduating from college. That's really fast. Probably sensing the sarcasm in my tone, she stuck out her proud chest and said loudly, Scarlett. This is President Blake's child. As she spoke, without giving me a chance to speak, she said quickly, President Blake said that we'll have the wedding next Saturday. He asked you to give me your wedding dress first. Are mistresses nowadays all so arrogant and domineering? I raised my hand and slapped her hard on the face, then started the car and left. I ignored Violet's hysterical curses. I knew that the wedding was getting closer. The invitation cards were already prepared, and all that was left was to send them out. Blake was getting a bit anxious. He wanted to come clean with me, but he needed to find an entry point. He had always been competitive and cared about his face. So, he would definitely not bow his head to me and admit his mistakes. During this month, he stayed out all night every day. There was the smell of a woman's perfume on him. Sometimes, there were suspicious red marks on his neck, and there were remaining lipstick marks on his shirt. If it were before, I wouldn't have been able to hold back and would have asked him. But during this period, I turned a deaf ear and a blind eye. As a last resort, he made Violet provoke me because he wanted to come clean. Relying on the fact that I liked him and loved him, he let Violet tell me about his affair with her. Based on his understanding of me, since the mistress had come to my door openly, I would surely quarrel with him. He was used to calculating. Even when breaking up, he needed to force me, push me to a dead end, and make me prostrate at his feet and humbly beg him to break up with me. He could take the opportunity to get rid of me, embrace the new person, and take over my wedding and everything that was mine legitimately. But I wouldn't give him this chance. 5 When I came back, Blake was actually at home. He sat upright on the sofa, looking at me with a condescending posture and a scrutinizing gaze. Scarlett. Violet just called me, he said as he watched me change my shoes at the entrance. Starting his performance, I knew that he was looking for trouble, that he wanted to quarrel, and that he wanted to force me to say we should break up. But I just looked at him calmly, with an indifferent and aloof gaze, as if looking at someone who didn't matter. What did she say to you on the phone? I deliberately smiled and said, she's your assistant. I suppose she was talking to you about work. The implication was very clear. I didn't need him to report to me, and I wasn't interested in knowing. After all, he used to yell at me like this, Scarlett. We're just in a work relationship. Do I have to report to you? My words seemed to make him very dissatisfied. He grabbed my arm, and it hurt a bit. Scarlett, do you know that she's pregnant? I forcefully shook off his hand. Before, when he was chasing me, once I accidentally scraped my arm a little. He was worried for a long time. He said he wanted to take me to the hospital. I smiled and said that it was just a small injury, so why go to the hospital? Later, he still wasn't at ease. So he ran to the pharmacy and bought all kinds of antiseptic solutions and applied them to me personally. He told me this and that, and even said that for such a small scratch, I needed to avoid certain foods. Afraid that I wouldn't like the food outside, he cooked for me himself. Although his cooking wasn't very delicious, but I could feel his thoughtfulness, which was warm. The difference between love and no love is really huge. I don't know when we started to be together in body but not in spirit. I smiled and said, I didn't know originally, but now I know. As I spoke, I was about to go back to my room. We don't love each other anymore. Does it matter whose child Violet is carrying? Whether it's his or someone else's? It's all the same to me. The main thing is that she's being shameless. She knew he had a girlfriend but still got involved, and she even came to show off in front of me. I was already being very polite by just slapping her once. But a certain man who was even more shameless than Violet stopped me. Scarlett, we need to have a good talk. I smiled charmingly, leaned closer to Blake, and said, what are we going to talk about? Your relationship with Violet? I know. It was for work needs. You used to say that. You got Violet pregnant because of work. I understand. I won't make a fuss about it unreasonably. And I won't be jealous either. Blake just stared at me blankly. We had been together for 7 years and in love for 7 years. We supported the startup of the company together and went through the most difficult times together. Naturally, we knew each other well. He was convinced that I loved him wholeheartedly and had lost myself in love. If I knew that Violet was pregnant and that the child was his, I would surely be extremely jealous and make a huge scene. In this regard, no matter how a woman makes a scene, the last word is usually just break up. This was the result he wanted. But I wasn't jealous anymore. When I didn't love him anymore, the sour taste of love naturally disappeared from my heart. Blake was still Blake. He took out a cigarette and lit it. Scarlett, I'm really in a difficult situation. At first, it was just for work, but now she's pregnant. I'm not young anymore. And my family is urging me to get married. My mother is also looking forward to having a grandson. I smiled gently and sensibly and said inferently, I've been preparing for the wedding for a long time. The banquet has been booked. And the invitation cards have been bought. Blake grabbed my hand and shouted, Scarlett. She's insisting on having a wedding. Here it comes. I sneered. She wants a wedding? Blake, do you mean that I should give the wedding that I've been preparing for a long time to Violet? I deliberately asked. What do you take me for? He opened his mouth. And after a long while, he said, Scarlett. It's just a wedding. We're not even getting a marriage certificate. She's pregnant now. And I need to placate her. Besides, she's just a young girl. How old are you? Even so, he reached out and wrapped his arms around my waist, hugging me, and said, Be good, Scarlett. Listen to me, I'll handle Violet's matter. We've been in love for 7 years. Don't you trust me? As he spoke, he actually pushed me onto the bed, intending to do something absurd. I turned over and got up, and said coldly that I wasn't interested. Blake, we're not young anymore. We don't need to indulge that little girl. You should also save some energy to take care of that little girl. Don't keep thinking about such pointless things. Although I really wanted to lose my temper, it wasn't the right time yet, so I suppressed my anger. The man in front of me used to have a tall and handsome figure and a jade-like appearance. But over the 7 years, from a young college student to a company boss who had experienced the ups and downs in the business world, there were already wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. Under the influence of alcohol and women, his former 8-pack abs had turned into a layer of fat on his belly. Thinking carefully, this man had given me the best years of his life. I didn't really lose out. It's just a wedding. I won't argue with the little girl about it, I said, and started packing my luggage. Since he had already come clean, I didn't want to live under the same roof as him anymore. The smell of cigarettes, alcohol, and the body odor and perfume of other women on him made me feel a bit nauseous. When you love someone, you can tolerate all their shortcomings. When you don't love them anymore, even their small details are magnified. Even his snoring at night makes me feel like it's as loud as thunder and is very disturbing. Seeing me packing my luggage, Blake's face darkened slightly, and he frowned and asked me, Scarlett, what are you doing? I smiled and said, Blake, you're going to marry Violet, so I should avoid suspicion and move out. I slapped your little girl today. You'd better soothe her, I said. Blake had a gloomy face as he watched me pack the few clothes I had into the suitcase. Only at this moment did he seem to realize belatedly that in this place where I had lived with him for 3 years, there were no longer any traces of my life. I had taken all my things with me. He lit another cigarette, and his voice carried a hint of melancholy as he asked me, Scarlett, what do you mean by this? I smiled, closed the suitcase, and dragged it as I said. Blake let out a low sorry. You're so boring. Didn't you tell me how old I am? I should be more tolerant of that little girl, right? You're about to have a wedding with her. If I still live with you, what will others think of me? I've been in love with you and known you for 7 years. Do you want me to live with the stigma of being a mistress? This time, he just kept a sullen face and didn't say anything. The next day, as soon as I arrived at the company, I felt that the atmosphere in the company was a bit off. Violet, with red eyes, handed me a box of small cakes. Scarlet. I'm sorry. It was my fault yesterday. She bowed and apologized to me. But I'm pregnant with President Blake's child. There's a little life growing inside me. As she spoke, she reached out and stroked her belly, looking at me with a pitiful expression. Scarlet. You're also a woman. You should know that for a woman. A child is really too important. I don't want my child to be born carrying the stigma of being a bastard. Please forgive me. I picked up the box of small cakes and threw it into the trash can. I smiled confidently and said, Violet. Whether your child is a bastard or not, you should talk it out clearly with that man and get married and get the marriage certificate as soon as possible. Instead of coming to me and babbling. I'm not the child's father. What exactly do you want me to forgive you for? After saying that, I walked straight to my office. Violet's face turned livid. Tears welled up in her eyes. And she looked as if she was on the verge of collapse. I smiled. Blake wasn't even here. Who was she trying to show this helpless and vulnerable act to? As for how the people in the company would discuss it behind my back, that was none of my business. Even though I didn't fan the flames. Everyone had sharp eyes these days. I had been in love with Blake for 7 years, and lived with him for 3 years. We had even set the date for the wedding. And I had already ordered my wedding dress. Now Violet had intervened. Not only did she sleep with Blake, but she was also trying to take my place by using the child. As a result, everyone in the company deliberately isolated Violet. There were already several versions of how Violet had slept with Blake being circulated, and they were described vividly. The personal matters were almost resolved. And now it was time for business matters. I had worked so hard in this company. Been busy to death, and stayed up countless nights. I had made all kinds of planning documents, and written all kinds of reports. Now that the company's business was booming, did someone want to take advantage of my efforts? How could that be possible? Thinking carefully. How long had it been since I had a rest? The company naturally had all kinds of holidays. Others could rest, and Blake could go drinking and karaoke, freely enjoying his youth. While I had to work for the company and its business, I had exhausted myself. I always thought that I had a double harvest in love and career. But in the end, it turned out to be a joke. Although I had comforted myself time and time again that going through hardships in the world was just about the 7 emotions and 6 desires, I had enjoyed the best times of Blake, so I didn't feel like I had suffered a loss. As for the company, everyone had a growth process, right? Until the day before Blake and Violet's wedding. I sent him an email. I told him that I had sold the shares of the company that I held. I resigned from my job. In addition, I congratulated him on his new marriage. Also, having fulfilled my obsession. And this was the most important point. I was getting engaged tomorrow. Although I knew that he didn't have time to attend my engagement banquet, I still sent him an invitation. Blake broke down. He called me and sent me messages. I was too lazy to listen. When I loved someone, I would ponder over even a single word for a long time. It was like doing a Chinese reading analysis. Carefully and meticulously. I would search for that little bit of pitiful warmth, love, and tenderness between the lines. I longed for the lingering of love. When I didn't love someone anymore, I no longer paid attention to any of his messages. I didn't want to hear his voice or see him. In the 5-star hotel, there weren't many guests. Because of Aiden's status, we only invited a small number of guests, and most of them were my acquaintances. I also thought I was rather pitiful and ridiculous. I had been abandoned, played with, and laughed at by Blake. But I wanted to use another man to salvage a little bit of my pitiful self-esteem. This was very unfair to Aiden. I had apologized to him several times and told him that if he cared, he could terminate this game at any time. He said that he was grateful to me for giving him such an opportunity. There weren't many guests on his side, but they were all important figures. Moreover, his parents had specially rushed back from abroad. This made me very embarrassed. Which good daughter-in-law would meet the parents of the man on the engagement banquet? Fortunately, hadn't fulfilled my obsession. Aden and I had discussed it and changed it to an engagement banquet instead of a wedding banquet. Aden told me that even if it was a game, he wanted to make this game more real and grand. So, the banquet was very luxurious. And there were roses all over the entrance. I put on the dress that I had customized for a long time and took Aden's arm. The moment I turned my head, I found that the man in front of me had delicate features and an imposing manner. When I served tea to Mother Zhou, I felt very guilty. But Mother Zhou gave me a big red envelope and also presented me with a pair of heirloom mutton fat jade bracelets. I felt even more guilty. Aden introduced his relatives and friends to me and took me to toast table by table. Without exception, the elders were busy stuffing red envelopes into my hands. I wasn't prepared for this at all. There were so many red envelopes. And happiness seemed to overflow and couldn't be contained. However, this was just a game of deceiving oneself and others. With Blake rushing into the engagement banquet scene, the atmosphere suddenly became a bit awkward. I didn't care at all at first. He had treated marriage as a trifle and me as a plaything. So naturally, I also treated him as a plaything. We were all just playing around. But in front of so many relatives and friends of Aden's family, I was afraid that Aden would lose face. Aden reached out and put his arm around my waist and whispered in my ear. "Scarlett. Don't be afraid. I'm here." Somehow, my restless heart suddenly settled down. Blake rushed up to me and reached out to pull me. However, Aden stopped him. "Blake, let out a low sigh. Is there something wrong?" The Den smiled gracefully and said, "I heard from Scarlett that you're getting married today. I thought you didn't have time to attend my engagement banquet with Scarlett." Blake's chest heaved up and down. His eyes were bloodshot. And his hair was a bit messy. As for his clothes, they were wrinkled. And he didn't look like he had come from a wedding banquet. I knew that when I told him yesterday that I had sold the company shares and that I was going to get engaged today. He didn't care whether I got engaged or not, but he cared about the company shares in my hands. "Scarlett. Tell me," he gasped for breath and pointed at me. "All of this is fake. You deliberately found someone to act, right?" "Yes, having fulfilled my obsession. All of this was fake. And I deliberately found someone to act. I was deliberately trying to make him angry. I might not love him anymore. But it didn't stop me from wanting to make him furious." I heard Aden's voice in my ear. Blake, do you think I'm an easy person?" As he spoke, he exerted strength with his hand, pulled me into his arms, lowered his head, and kissed my lips heavily. A dense breath swept over me overwhelmingly, surrounding me layer by layer without leaving any gaps. I almost suffocated in his arms. And I just felt that my cheeks were burning hot. I guess they were very red. Around us, there was thunderous applause and also the sound of whistles. Blake, Baden, am getting engaged to Scarlett today. I can't promise forever. But in this life, I will never let her down. This promise was too heavy. And it made it hard for me to breathe. Blake's face looked extremely ugly. First, it turned iron blue. And then it turned the color of pig liver. It seemed as if it was congested with blood. He pointed at me and cursed. "Scarlett, do you really have to humiliate me in this way?" I finally caught my breath, leaned against Aiden's arms, and smiled softly. Blake, I don't understand what you're talking about. I was in love with you for 7 years. This was a well-known thing. And I didn't plan to hide it. So, I said it openly at the engagement banquet. Now, you're marrying Violet. And I found another good match. I don't know what you mean by humiliation. Suddenly, he seemed to go crazy. He picked up a chair and smashed it hard on the dining table. Suddenly, the cups and plates were in a mess. Scattered on the ground in pieces. Just like my former love with him, which had been shattered into pieces by his own hands. The edges were sharp, stabbing into my heart, making it a bloody mess. I didn't know why he was so angry. Why did you sell the shares?" he asked me loudly. However, Aden had already called the hotel security guards and the bodyguards of his Aden family and asked him to leave. The hotel staff quickly cleaned up the mess and set out new food and wine. With extremely skillful movements. Blake was like a joke. He burst in with great fanfare and left in a sorry state. In the end, he didn't even get a clear answer to his question. I also couldn't figure out that the shares were mine. And when I sold my shares, what did it have to do with him? 10 After the engagement banquet ended, I planned to go on vacation in Hainan. I told Aiden. I started working on the company before I even graduated from college. I haven't had a good time in all these years. I'm going to take up the position of the chief financial officer of Kiyuan soon. And I'm afraid I'll be even busier. Taking advantage of this period, I want to have a good vacation. He smiled and agreed, telling me to have a good time for a few days first. After selling the shares of Jiangju Company, I had more than 50 million yuan in my hand. So I could be considered to have some assets. I was busy looking for travel guides on the internet. Aden said he was going to sign me up for a tour group, but I planned to travel on my own, going wherever I felt like it. Going with the tour group was just about checking in at scenic spots. I didn't want to be too busy. At dusk one day, Blake knocked on the door of my house. Although I didn't want to see him at all now, I still invited him in. Without any unnecessary words, he directly asked me, "Scarlett, don't you think you should give me an explanation?" I was really curious. What explanation did he want? "Why did you sell the shares of Jiangju?" He asked me directly, pointing at me. Absolutely furious. "Do you really have to take revenge on me in this way? I've told you many times. It's just a wedding. It's okay for you to have a little tantrum sometimes. This time, you've gone too far. Scarlett, I won't forgive you." I felt as if I had heard the most ridiculous joke and asked. Blake let out a low sigh. "How exactly do you plan not to forgive me?" I want to break up with you," he said angrily with red eyes. "Scarlett, you have no tolerance at all." I smiled with my eyes and brows curved and said, "Blake, I know you treat marriage as a trifle, but you shouldn't be so careless in this game. You already have a child with Violet. The invitation cards have been sent out, and the wedding has been held. Now you're telling me you want to break up? Sorry. I got rid of you a long time ago. Didn't you know that until now? I originally thought that. After all, you're a highly educated person and there shouldn't be any communication problems. But now I realize. Did you forget to bring your brain when you went out?" He raised his hand and smashed the teacup on my table hard onto the floor. In an instant, my beautiful teacup broke into pieces. What a tragedy. He stared straight at me. This man used to have a tall and handsome figure, as elegant as a jade tree in the wind. Now he was left with nothing but decadence and exhaustion. I could smell the stench of decay on him. "Scarlett, do you know that the Zhu Consortium has always wanted to annex Jiangju Pharmaceutical Company? If you sell the shares to him, he can take control of Jiangju. But Den doesn't love you at all. Who are you? And who is he? Do you really think that with your aging face, you can seduce him? He just wants to deceive you into giving him the shares in your hand so that he can take control of Jiangju Company and ruin us." I really had no idea what he was trying to say. He was long-winded and kept belittling me. Before, I always hoped that he would have some free time to accompany me more, to chat with me, even if it was just to complain. But now, why do I feel that every word he says is like a big housefly, flapping its wings and making that disgusting buzzing sound? So, I interrupted him directly. Blake let out a low sigh. "I know that Aden is acquiring the shares of Jiangju Pharmaceutical Company in my hand just to take control. Then he can further annex Jiangju Company. As for whether he loves me or not, that's my business and has nothing to do with you. Please mind your own business. If you have nothing else to do, please leave and don't bother me. Also, Blake, Wegao, as a married man, you need to pay attention to your boundaries. Don't just come to another woman's house casually. If you want to see me next time, please make an appointment in advance. Don't just show up unannounced. We're not that close." Finally, having fulfilled my session, Blake broke down. He roared at me. "Scarlett, when you sold the shares, did you ever think about me? What am I supposed to do? Don't you know that without Jiangju Company, I have no way out but death? My family won't tolerate me. And neither will the outside world. Do you really have to push me to a dead end?" This time, I couldn't hold back. I raised my hand and slapped him hard on the face. and then slapped him again with the back of my hand. My hands hurt a bit from the slaps. After hitting him, I pointed at his nose and cursed. Blake let out a low sigh. Do you still have any shame? That's right. You've never had any shame. As a collateral branch of the Blake family, your family gave you a precarious company and then kicked you out. In his sophomore year of college, something happened in the Lou group, and the family started to divide their assets. Blake was just a collateral branch of the Blake family, not a direct descendant. The Blake family gave him a small company that was on the verge of bankruptcy. He came to me to pour out his troubles. I sold a house in Chang that my father left me and invested the money into the company. I got the shares of Xianju Company. From that moment on, I was bound to Xianju Company. While others were enjoying their college life, dating, shopping in malls, and watching movies, I was working my hardest for the company, struggling desperately, and also busy with my studies. Xianju Company was revitalized, and its performance got better and better every year. We also had more money in our hands. He bought a house without telling me and didn't write my name on it. He directly left all the decoration matters to me. When I suggested getting married, he said we were still young and there was no need to rush. When I got pregnant and wanted to give birth to the child, he drugged me. He said that the company had just gotten on the right track and he wasn't ready to be a father yet. He didn't want me to be tied down by trivial matters at this crucial moment. I should devote all my time and energy to the company's performance. That's right. I had poured all my efforts into that small company, and I couldn't bear to part with it. So, I threw myself into the company even more desperately, continuing to strive and struggle. 11's Xianju Company could be regarded as a witness to our love. I thought that in the end, Blake and I would eventually get married. He was just being childish. I was 27 years old and he was 28 years old. His family started urging us to get married. Mother Lou also said that she was getting old and wanted to have a grandson. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. I started preparing for the wedding, and he didn't object. But at this moment, he got a college girl pregnant. He said he disliked me because I had had an abortion and there had been a dead life in my belly. That I was dirty. Why didn't he mention that he secretly gave me the abortion pill? Blake asked me to give the wedding to Violet. He also used PUA on me, saying that I was old enough and shouldn't argue with that young girl. How ironic, the ex worked like a slave for the company, and the current one was going to have his child and raise it? Where in the world could there be such a good thing? Blake, wake up. Whether you live or die has nothing to do with me. For me, Xianju Company is like a pig that I've carefully raised. Once it's fattened up, of course, I have to sell it. My words seemed to have a great impact on Blake. He stumbled out of my house like a walking corpse. I didn't care at all and continued to study my travel guide. The next day, I received a call from Violet. On the phone, she also seemed hysterical. I found that in some ways, she and Blake were quite a match. No wonder they could be together. After all, their absurd remarks were very consistent. Scarlett, do you really have to use such a clumsy method to compete with me for Blake? Do you think that just because you sold the shares of Xianju Company, he will value you? We're already married. If you keep making a scene like this, you'll just make yourself look bad. She roared at me on the phone. On the day Blake and Violet got married, I was busy with my engagement, so I naturally didn't know about the farce on their side. But after all, we were all in the same circle. My WeChat moments was flooded with messages about it. The day before, after Blake learned that I had sold the shares of Xianju Company, he became a bit crazy. He drank his sorrows away all night and smoked all night. He kept sending me harassing messages. I couldn't stand it anymore and blocked him. The next day, of course, he didn't go to pick up the bride. Instead, he asked around to find out my whereabouts. Although I told him I was going to get engaged, he didn't believe me. It wasn't until the engagement banquet started that he seemed to wake up from a dream and came to make a scene at my engagement banquet. After being embarrassingly escorted out, he started drinking again. Violet kept calling him, asking for this and that. How much betrothal gift she wanted. What kind of 5 gold items to buy. And she even asked Blake when her wedding dress would be delivered. I had never seen such a ridiculous wedding. In the end, Violet took a taxi to the hotel herself, only to find that the wedding MC wasn't there. However, since the invitation cards had been sent out, relatives and friends still showed up. This farce started grandly, but ended in loneliness. From beginning to end, Blake never went to the wedding banquet. I sneered on the phone. Violet. For me, heading fulfilled my obsession. Blake is just a man I'm tired of. Thank you for taking him. Keep an eye on him and don't let him harass me again. Don't call me to harass me either. We're not familiar with each other. As for the shares? Of course. I'm going to sell the pig that I've painstakingly fattened up. Does it have anything to do with others when I sell my pig? With that, I hung up the phone and blocked her number as well. When I went on a trip to Hainan, my friend told me that Blake had gone crazy. He hit Violet. And he also smashed 2 laptops and the venue at the company's shareholders' meeting. Of course, all of this had nothing to do with me anymore. 12 Blake. When Blake first saw Scarlett in college, his eyes were involuntarily drawn to her. That girl was wearing a blue long dress and dancing under the ginkgo tree, like a fluttering butterfly. At first, he was attracted by her graceful dance. When he got closer, he found that she had a pair of extremely beautiful almond-shaped eyes. And there was a bright red cinnabar mole under her eyelid. It was said that this was a mole that brought good luck to her husband. His grandmother had once told him that if he ever met a girl with such a facial feature, he must definitely pursue her and win her heart. Blake didn't know whether it was his grandmother's words that made him see her through rose-colored glasses or whether she was truly extremely beautiful. At that time, Scarlett had skin as white as snow, a graceful figure, and was as beautiful as a fairy. He made some inquiries on the side and learned that she had several suitors around her. That's right. For a beautiful girl, who wouldn't have a few suitors? He started to use all his means to pursue her. After getting to know her, he found that she was a very practical girl. She didn't daydream or be vain. She just liked to live a down-to-earth life. At that time, Blake felt that he had found a treasure. However, there was an internal conflict in the Blake family, and he was assigned a small pharmaceutical company on the verge of bankruptcy. This was his only capital, and he had to revitalize the company. So, he was busy running around, trying to attract investments. Scarlett's sold a house in Chang and invested the money in the company. Blake felt that his grandmother was right. This girl had the appearance of bringing good luck to her husband. At the same time, he also persuaded several elders in his family to invest some money in the company. Just like that, he and Scarlett started to run business, make business plans, and work desperately. Gradually, the company began to show signs of improvement and started making profits. They had money now. His grandmother told him that the girl was nice and her family didn't have overly complicated relationships. There was just her old mother. He should set the wedding date as soon as possible and not let down such a good girl. But at that time, he had just graduated from university. He was young and handsome, and yet he was already the boss of a company. He thought he had a bright future ahead. It was a time when the sea was wide enough for fish to leap and the sky was high enough for birds to fly. How could he decide on his whole life just because of Scarlett at this moment? He smiled and told his grandmother that it was okay. Scarlett couldn't run away as she had shares in Xianju company. His grandmother sighed and just said that she was old. She didn't persuade him anymore after that. Coincidentally, heading Fostelway sub. Just at this moment, Scarlett got pregnant. Blake watched as she happily told him that she was pregnant and that she wanted to give birth to the child. At that moment, he suddenly became angry. Even more, he felt a bit disgusted with her. She seemed to be like all the ordinary women in the world, trying to tie him down with a child, as well as his money and his company. Deep in his heart, he really longed to be like the real young masters of the Blake family. To be flattered by the world, to interact with the rich and noble, and to chat and laugh among the many socialites in Chang. He didn't want to get married at all. And even less did he want to have a child to hold him back in life at this time. If he stepped onto the path of marriage, his life would stop there. He was not willing at all. He quarreled with her. Moreover, if she was pregnant and giving birth, what would happen to all the matters of the company? Did he really have to work overtime to write business plans, prepare reports, handle business affairs, all the while being deliberately made things difficult for him and having to curry favor with others? Scarlett had always been gentle in nature and gave in to him in everything. But only in this matter did she argue strongly and refused to have the abortion no matter what. As a last resort, he started to seek external help. Someone suggested that if he really didn't want the child, it would be okay to put a little abortion pill in her diet. Although pharmacies were strictly regulated now, that was for ordinary people. He himself had a small pharmaceutical company. So why worry about not being able to get it through his connections? Yes. He easily obtained what he wanted. He crushed it and added it to her diet. On the third day, she had excruciating abdominal pain and started bleeding. Blake let out a sigh of relief and quickly drove her to the hospital. In the car, he confessed to her. He had said that he didn't want this child. And he was also the father of the child. He had the right to make the decision. Scarlett was very angry. After having the abortion in the hospital, she gave him the cold shoulder. At that time, Blake was also angry. How could she be so unreasonable? Trying to control his life with a little life? He had always hated women who were self-righteous and tried to control a man's money and life by sleeping with him. He thought she was different, but in the end, she was so vulgar that it made him uncomfortable. He felt really blocked up inside. That night, he drank a lot of alcohol, smoked a lot of cigarettes, and also watched some explanations and videos about abortion on the internet. He didn't know why, but when he learned that when a woman had an abortion, it meant a life coming out from that place, he had a huge psychological shadow. He always felt that it was very dirty. Yes, heading full wide session. She had bled a lot in his car that day. It was dirty, fishy, and stinky. He sent the car to the car wash and had it cleaned inside and out many times. But he still felt that the car was filled with a strong smell of blood and an unmaskable fishy odor. Scarlett started to throw herself into work again. After all, there were so many things to do in the company. If she didn't do them, who would? Look. Blake once again admired his wise choice. If Scarlett had been allowed to get pregnant and give birth to a child, what would have happened to the company? The company that he had managed to revitalize with great difficulty must never go downhill. So, Scarlett was selfish and unreasonable. Couldn't she be more understanding of men? 13 Blake was almost moved. Since the woman was so unreasonable, did he still have to coax her with a submissive attitude? To coax her, he bought her a Hermes bag. To coax her, he perked up again and created the romance that belonged to them. He even went so far as to cook for her despite not being used to it. But no matter what, Blake always felt very uncomfortable in his heart. He always thought that although she was beautiful, she was dirty. When he met Violet, he was very happy. This girl was young and beautiful. She had a slender and soft waist, long legs, and healthy hair like a waterfall. Her big, watery eyes were like those of a deer. He transferred her to be his assistant. Sure enough, Scarlett was being unreasonable again. She was jealous, made a scene, and targeted Violet. Blake was very angry. Couldn't she have a bit of self-awareness? How old was she? Couldn't she be more tolerant of that young girl? Which successful man didn't have a few young and beautiful girls around him? At this crucial moment, Scarlett actually said that she wanted to get married. That's right. His family also started urging him to get married. His grandmother passed away 2 years ago. Her only wish before she died was that he could get married and have children. Well, okay. Let's get married. It was just a wedding. If she wanted it, he would give it to her. But then, Violet got pregnant. He didn't know why, but Blake suddenly remembered that Scarlett had had an abortion before. That's right. There had been a dead life in her belly. Blake shivered involuntarily. If he married Scarlett and they had a child in the future, his child would have stayed in such a place for 10 months. And then be born? A place where a life had once died? The more he thought about it, the more horrified Blake became. He fell into deep thought. At this time, Violet also started to make trouble with him. She was pregnant and wanted to give birth to the child. She said to him. Blake let out a low sigh. This is the crystallization of our love. She smiled charmingly, which made Blake feel a pang of pity for her. Blake. It's really amazing. A little life is growing in my belly. It's so wonderful. She took his hand and touched her smooth belly like jade, telling him that there was a little baby inside. That was his child. He followed her hand and slid down along the smooth skin. Violet's body made him enjoy extreme comfort. Wasn't it just a wedding? Scarlett had been preparing for it for a long time. Her figure was similar to Violet's, so the wedding dress would probably fit. Blake considered how to bring this up to Scarlett. If he brought it up directly, she would definitely not agree and would probably make a huge scene. But it didn't matter. Women were jealous. If she knew about his relationship with Violet, she would surely quarrel with him. What else could a woman do besides crying, making a scene, threatening to commit suicide, and breaking up? Blake smiled. He already had a plan in mind. He decided that he would make Scarlett bring up the idea herself. Breaking up. In this way, he could take over the wedding that she had been preparing for a long time in a legitimate way. He could marry the woman who had given him physical pleasure while holding her in his arms. As for Scarlett? Blake smiled sarcastically. She held Sherzan's Yanju company, and she was destined to be his exclusive possession. She would never be able to run away in her whole life. 14 Blake knew that Scarlett had asked someone to choose an auspicious day according to the lunar calendar. The wedding date was getting very close. He deliberately stayed out all night. Deliberately got lipstick from other women on his shirt. And had all kinds of perfume smells on his body. He deliberately ignored her. But Scarlett seemed not to notice at all. Perhaps she was too busy with work. And she also started to ignore him. Look. A woman who claimed to love him couldn't even take care of his basic life once she got busy. Fortunately, they didn't have a child 3 years ago. Otherwise, it would have been a mess of trivial matters. God knew if she would still have the energy to manage all the matters inside and outside the company. Blake increasingly felt that it was really a wise decision for him to give her the abortion pill 3 years ago. He even wanted to give himself a thumbs up. He had never regretted his decision at that time. Scarlett was too busy to quarrel with him or to break up with him. But the wedding was getting closer day by day. As a last resort, Blake asked Violet to go and confessed to Scarlett. She was already pregnant. If Scarlett was reasonable, she should be more tolerant of that young girl. As a result, she actually hit her? Blake was very angry. He questioned her. But she actually lost her temper and wanted to live separately from him? Watching her seriously packing her luggage and moving out, Blake became more and more impatient. Why was this woman so unreasonable? How old was she? And she was still acting like a young girl and trying to break up? So childish. That night, he shouted at her furiously. Scarlett. I'm telling you that if you dare to move out, don't ever come back, Blake said harshly. Women shouldn't be spoiled. He had spoiled her too much before. And now she had developed a bad temper. Wasn't she just trying to make him coax her like this? But couldn't she be more understanding of him? Didn't she know that he needed to coax a pregnant girl? That night, Scarlett dragged her suitcase and left without looking back. Blake was so furious that he went to a bar and drank his sorrows away all night. He swore that this time, even if Scarlett made up with him, he would ignore her for a while. Lest she didn't know her own place. Blake had never taken the wedding with Violet seriously. Anyway, having fulfilled my obsession, Scarlett would definitely arrange everything well, and he didn't need to worry about it. But on the night before the wedding, he received an email. It was from Scarlett. Look. It had only been a few days. And she was already trying to make peace with him again? He was a bit annoyed inside. But thinking that he was going to have the wedding with Violet the next day, he still opened the email. After reading the email, Blake was furious. This woman not only didn't apologize to him or make peace with him, but she still wanted to make a scene? He had really spoiled her too much. This time, he would never forgive her unless she knelt on the ground and begged him. That night, Blake received calls from 2 of his uncles. Blake let out a low sigh. I sold the shares of Jianju Company. Well, after all, since Scarlett has sold hers, it's no use for us to keep ours. His uncle said with a happy smile on the phone. What did you say? Blake immediately shouted. His two uncles didn't have many shares in Jeonju Company. But Scarlett had 35 of the original shares of Jeonju Company. His uncle smiled and said, Blake, let out a low sigh. I originally thought that you would marry Scarlett. After all, you've been in a relationship for so many years. I just wanted to hold the shares quietly and get a little dividend. Now, you're going to marry someone else. And Scarlett is also going to get married. This small company, Jeonju, can no longer afford any more disruptions. While it's still worth some money, I sold my shares. Let's take a look at other industries. Blake, you got out a low sigh. I won't be able to attend your wedding tomorrow. I'm going to attend Scarlett's engagement banquet instead. The Aiden family is a big and influential clan. At this point, his uncle hung up the phone. It seemed that he heard someone say on the phone, Why are you talking so much to him? The third son of the Blake family is just a person without any good fortune. 15 Blake had only one thought in his mind. Scarlett had sold the shares of Jeonju Company. And she was going to get engaged to someone else? How dare she? No, who was she going to get engaged to? Was she just going to pick up a random man on the street? He knew that this woman was not well behaved. She must have colluded with his two uncles to deceive him. Was she using such low and despicable means to disgust him? He called Scarlett. He was determined to scold this woman severely. He was so angry that his lungs were about to explode. It wasn't enough that she hired a random man to hold an engagement banquet to disgust him. She was also threatening him by selling the shares of Jeonju in her hand. Who gave her the courage? However, Scarlett hung up on him. When he called again, he found that Scarlett had blocked him. At this moment, Blake's anger reached its peak. This woman had grown some backbone. If she had the guts, she should block him for the rest of her life. Just as Blake was trying to find out Scarlett's whereabouts, a call came in. He sneered. He was certain that this call must be from Scarlett. This time, he was going to teach her a lesson. So, he hung up the phone. The call came in again. He sneered. As expected, it was that woman. He answered the call and let out a cold snort from his nose. He was waiting for Scarlett to explain to him, however. A man's voice came from the phone. Blake, I'm the new executive CEO of Jeonju Company. There will be a meeting at 10 a.m. tomorrow. I know you're getting married tomorrow. But that's none of my business. If you don't come, it means you're abstaining. After the other person finished speaking, without giving him any chance, he directly hung up the phone. Blake threw the phone in his hand. The phone screen shattered into pieces. As a last resort, he had to pick up the phone and call his uncle. Uncle, did you really sell the shares? It was a bit noisy on his uncle's end. It seemed that they were drinking. Yeah. His uncle smiled. He had drunk a bit too much. He was really happy today. Even though he had always disliked his nephew Blake, he was willing to chat a bit more. The shares are all sold. I have to say, it's still Scarlett. This girl is reliable. Just looking at her makes me feel at ease. She led us to make money together. Oh, Blake. I won't talk to you anymore. Your aunt is busy choosing a gift for Scarlett. With that, his uncle was about to hang up the phone. Blake roared. Uncle. Who is she getting engaged to? His uncle asked in surprise. Don't you know? Didn't I just say? It's Aiden, the young master of the Zoo Consortium. That boy is really handsome. He's a good match for Scarlett. Stop chatting. I'm still busy here. With that, his uncle hung up the phone again. Blake rushed out and asked around for information. He learned that Scarlett and Aiden were getting engaged tomorrow. Due to the tight schedule, not many people were invited to the engagement banquet. However, Aiden's parents had rushed back from abroad. This wasn't that Scarlett hired a male model from a nightclub and randomly found someone to hold an engagement to disgust him. It was that not only did she fall in love with someone else, but she also ruined Jeonju Company. Blake just felt a sweet and fishy taste in his throat, and it was also smelly. It was very much like the smell that Scarlett left in his car when she had an abortion. He tried hard to swallow that mouthful of fishy and stinky blood. 16 Blake just felt his eyes go dark. How could she do this? You can't be too good to a woman. Otherwise, She won't know her place. Not only did she sell the shares of Jeonju Company, but she also persuaded his two uncles to sell their shares together. Did she know what she was doing? That was the company that he had worked so hard to revitalize. It had finally started making a profit, and had become a golden goose that laid golden eggs. But now she had sold it directly. And she was going to get engaged to another man? Angry. So angry. He would never forgive this woman again. Even if she came back and knelt at his feet to apologize to him, he wouldn't forgive her. No matter how angry he was. The next day, Jeonju Company was taken over by someone else. And he still held a small number of shares in Jeonju Company. So, the company informed him to attend a meeting. They informed him again and again, saying that if he didn't come, it would be regarded as abstaining. He wanted to go. But Violet also kept calling him, asking for this and that. She wanted the betrothal gift, the money for opening the door, and the money for getting in the car. She informed him how many red envelopes to prepare and how many of her relatives had children. It was only then that Blake vaguely remembered that, right, he was getting married today. It was a major event in his life. However, he had never taken this wedding seriously. At first, he was perfunctory to Scarlett. Later, he tried to hoodwink Violet. He shouted at Violet on the phone and questioned her what she had said to Scarlett. Violet was also very angry. Blake, what do you mean? We're getting married soon. Why are you still asking about Scarlett? Blake, what soy? What time will you come? Blake, wake. It's almost the auspicious time. Are you coming or not? I'm telling you. If you don't come soon, don't come at all. I won't marry you anymore. In the end, Blake didn't go to pick up the bride. Instead, he went to make a scene at Scarlett and Aiden's engagement banquet. He saw Scarlett put on the wedding dress that she had customized for a long time. However, the man beside her wasn't him, but another man. He watched as Aiden put a 3-carat pink diamond ring on her hand, declaring his dominance. It was only then that Blake noticed that the silver ring that Scarlett had always worn on her hand was gone. He didn't know when she had taken it off. That silver ring was a gift from him to her. At that time, they were still in school. They had just confirmed their relationship, and he didn't have much money. He had spent a long time choosing a silver ring for her. She liked it very much. She regarded it as a precious treasure. Over the years, when she had money, she bought all kinds of expensive jewelry and rings. But she always wore that silver ring on her hand. She said that it was a symbol of their love. Now, she had put on the expensive pink diamond ring and discarded that silver ring. Blake went crazy. He smashed the banquet and rushed up to question her. How could she betray their love and get engaged to another man? She must be deliberately trying to make him angry. However, that man hugged her and kissed her. In the end, Blake was driven away by the security guards, looking extremely embarrassed. He had never been so embarrassed in his life. Even after all this, Violet actually questioned him what he really wanted. Blake, what out? Are you a scumbag? I'm marrying you. And yet you actually ran to find your ex? Violet was also very angry. She had tried her best, offered her body, and coaxed him gently and flattered him. As a young and innocent girl, her goal when she joined Jeonju Company was just to seduce Blake and rise to a higher position. Her goal was clear, and her actions were quick. She had also successfully gotten pregnant, and Blake was willing to marry her. Scarlett knew when to retreat and withdrew on her own, no longer making any pointless struggles. After all, she was just an old woman who had lost her beauty. What could she use to compete with her? Violet sneered in her heart. However, this old woman had actually hooked up with a better, richer, and more handsome man and got engaged to him at the fastest speed. And Blake had actually gone crazy because of her? She was also very angry. Blake fainted on the roadside and was taken to the hospital by passers-by who called 120. According to the doctor's diagnosis, it was said that due to excessive drinking, emotional excitement, and lack of rest, he had exhausted his physical strength and fainted on the ground. A few days later, Blake woke up in the hospital and learned that Jeonju Company had already become an empty shell company. The shears in his hand were worthless. He couldn't hold it back and vomited a mouthful of blood again. His eyes went dark. And he fell over. 17 It was already very cold in Hai Cheng at this time. In the autumn and winter seasons. The leaves had all turned yellow and withered. There were no more flowers. Everyone had already put on thick sweaters. And some even wrapped themselves in down jackets. However, Hainan was different. It was a place without four seasons. Only summer. The sea water was clear and blue. Under the sunlight, colorful angelfish shuttled through the water. I changed into a diving suit and went for a deep dive. After playing in the sea for half a day, it was really a bit boring to be alone. It was even difficult to find someone to take a photo of me. Just as I was lost in thought, suddenly someone called me. Scarlett, do you want to play in the water? I was stunned for a moment. Turned around. And saw Eden standing by the seaside, wearing a silver-white shirt. He had a tall and handsome figure and a beautiful face. Even among thousands of people, he still stood out like a crane among chickens. I smiled and said, "Why are you here?" "I came here to play in the water with you." But Den smiled and said. As he spoke, he reached out and pulled me closer, wiping the sand off my face. I was a bit unaccustomed to his overly intimate behavior, although it was said that I was engaged to him. In fact, I was just taking revenge on Blake. Using one man to take revenge on another man was a low and despicable means. In Blake's words, it was also very despicable. Despicable as it was. As long as it worked. There was no reason that after dating him for 7 years, I was finally drugged by him and then he disliked me and thought I was dirty. I didn't even have the courage to take revenge. Scarlett, have you forgotten all about it? Eden reached out and pressed on a not-so-conspicuous scar on my head, which was hidden under my temple hair. The sealed memories gradually emerged in my mind. That year, I was only 4 years old. My father was a lifeguard at a beach resort. I followed my father and played by the seaside every day. As a lifeguard, he had instilled in me some knowledge of underwater first aid since I was a child. I was excellent at swimming. My father said that I seemed to be born able to swim. With an elegant and beautiful posture. Very much like a mermaid. That day, just like usual, I was wearing a pink little swimsuit and carrying a small bucket, digging sand on the beach. However, I saw a white wave coming and knocking a child down. The child struggled desperately, but was carried further and further away by the waves. There were a lot of people at the beach resort, all playing and frolicking, and no one noticed that child at all. I shouted loudly and ran towards the sea, splashing around. I don't know how I managed to grab that older boy. But I was too weak. Even though I was good at swimming and knew about the water, it was impossible for me to drag a boy bigger than me onto the shore. I desperately called for help, struggled, and held onto him tightly. After that, I don't remember anything. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. My mother's eyes were red and swollen terribly. That day, I lost my father. I heard that 2 little boys were playing and fooling around in the water. And they went into the deep water area while playing. They were accidentally swept away by the white waves. One of the lucky ones was grabbed by me. And I kept calling for help, and finally managed to save him. But my father died while searching for the other child. Eden's fingers carried a trace of warmth as they touched the cinnabar mole on my face. Scarlett. The day I saw you, I recognized you. Eden smiled and said that he didn't know if he really liked me or if it was a mentality of repaying a favor. But the moment he saw me, he just felt that I was the cinnabar mole in his heart. Originally, having fulfilled Nadsa, since I was in love with Blake, he didn't want to disturb my happiness anymore. However, he found out that Blake was really a scumbag. Not only was he having an affair with 2 women at the same time, but he was also boasting about vulgar jokes about him and me outside. He really couldn't stand it. He couldn't just watch me fall headlong into it and sacrifice my whole life's happiness. So, he deliberately reminded me. I thought about it seriously and then said, Eden, was the house in Hai Cheng that my father left me also the compensation your family gave to my father back then? It can be considered as compensation. Eden pulled me, and we sat down by the seaside. He told me that when he almost drowned at the beach resort when he was a child, it wasn't an accident at all, but a premeditated murder. Knowing that the two children were going to play in the water at the beach resort, someone put drugs in their food at noon. Then, parental so blindsided. Someone deliberately encouraged the naive children to enter the deep water area. My cousin drowned, and it also affected your father. We almost died too, he said, reaching out and pulling me into his arms. I didn't ask any more about the other things related to the big family. Scarlett. If it weren't for you giving me air underwater, I would have died too, he said, reaching out and pinching my face. When I was a child, you gave me a breath of life and saved me. Now that I'm grown up, I should promise you my life and protect you for the rest of my life. Was this his confession and his promise? But there were no roses. The scene wasn't right. And the way it happened wasn't right either. But I didn't seem to care at all. My head was a bit dizzy. Goodness. I hope I'm not going to develop a struck mentality. Am I? Dan and I played in Hainan for more than a week before we came back. He made arrangements to buy me a house first and asked me to move in. 18 something I never expected happened. At dusk one day, Blake was leaning against my door, waiting for me. When he saw me, he beamed with joy and handed me the roses in his hand, which were a bit dark red. Scarlett. You're back? He said. And he was also about to get hands. Why? I was so angry that I threw the roses in his face and kicked him as well. Blake, la parva. What are you up to again? I said with a cold face. Scarlett. I've thought about it carefully these past few days. I know that you're just jealous and deliberately trying to make me angry. He ran his fingers through his hair and smiled at me. Then he said in a self-righteous tone, thinking he could control me. Let's make up. Stop quarreling. I won't hold it against you for selling the company shares either. I really couldn't understand what he was trying to say. Make up? Did we break up? I dumped him. Why didn't he have any self-awareness? Did he think he was still that handsome and elegant college boy from back then? With the capital to be proud? I sneered and mocked. Blake, you should care. I sold my shares. And it's none of your business. Show me how you care? He shouted angrily. Scarlett. Shut up and listen to me. He seemed to be trying hard to control his temper. And his eyes were slightly red. I frowned and took a step back to keep a distance from him. Scarlett. I heard from my uncle that you sold your shares for 50 million yuan. He said. Here's what I promise. I'll break up with Violet. Let's start over. We'll register another company. This time, you don't need to take the shares. Otherwise, I'm afraid you'll do something so stupid again when you lose your mind. Anyway, all the company's customer resources are in your hands. We can make a comeback soon. I held back the urge to slap him in the face again. They say that men are like boys until they die. But I feel that men can change. The former Blake was diligent, ambitious, gentle, considerate, romantic, and tender. But now, all I see in him is humble confidence and cheap inferiority. Blake let out a low sigh. I know you're bankrupt. I took a deep breath and suppressed the rising anger in my heart. If there's no mirror at home, you can always pee, right? Take a good look at yourself in it. I have 50 million yuan. What do you have? Why should I spend money to register a company for you? And I don't even get the shares? Where do you get the nerve? At this point, I paused, reached out and patted his face, and said, wake up. When I sold the shares of Xianju Company, I was planning to ruin you. Stop making a scene. Just live a good life with your Violet. You two, a scumbag and a slut, are a perfect match. Stay together forever. He went crazy, grabbed my wrist, choked my neck, and angrily scolded. Scarlett. How could you do this? Did you ruin Xianju Company out of jealousy? How could you be so vicious? This time, I didn't tolerate him. I kicked him hard between his legs. Looking at him bending over in pain, I sneered. Blake, Kevin Fulso Wade Sarshun. I'm telling you, I'm not jealous. I just feel that my 7 years of youth were wasted. So, I ruined Xianju Company and made you go bankrupt. You're such a scumbag that you're not even worth my jealousy anymore. I once loved you. Now. Look at yourself. What do you have that's worth a woman being jealous of? Come on. Violet doesn't know you're bankrupt yet. Does she? If she finds out, she'll abandon you like a piece of trash just like that. Only you are still living in your own fantasy. I called the community security guards, and Ed Blake escorted away again. As I expected. After Violet learned that Xionju Company had become an empty shell company. Several shareholders had already sold their shares and left with the money. Only the bankrupt Blake was left. She made a decisive decision and went to the hospital to have an abortion. The child she was carrying was already 5 months old, and the fetus had already taken shape. She was really a ruthless person. She actually put the aborted fetus in a glass bottle and sent it to Blake. She also demanded the abortion fee, nutrition fee, and compensation from Blake. Epilogue: It is said that Blake went crazy. After having another quarrel with Violet, he drove towards her. That wasn't all. He also reversed the car several times and ran over her repeatedly. Violet died a terrible death, and her body was in pieces. Blake was arrested and sentenced to death with a 3-month reprieve. While he was in custody, he kept asking to see me. But I refused. I didn't want to see a crazy death row inmate at all. Blake was just a passerby in my life. I joined Kyuan Consortium and became the chief financial officer of Kyuan Consortium. My life is busy and fulfilling. Adan and I also started our own sweet and warm relationship. The end of the whole book.